Okay, well, I will go ahead and get started and let other folks in the waiting room as they arrive. Want to thank you all for joining us. This is our final Public Service Perspectives presentation of the semester. So thanks so much for joining us throughout the whole spring semester. We're really excited for the presentation today. Just a couple quick notes of housekeeping before we get started. We do ask you to remain muted throughout the session just so that we avoid disruptions, but feel free to comment in the chat. We can have a lot of dialogue in there. You can drop questions in there and we'll be taking questions at the end, which you can use the raise your hand feature if you'd like to ask aloud. We welcome you to keep your camera on. I know it's the lunch hour and you're probably enjoying your lunch or hanging out outside on this beautiful day, but we do welcome you to have your camera on throughout. We'd love to see your faces and connect with you. Before I turn it over to Dr. Natalie Cruz to introduce our speaker today, I just want to take a moment to see if anyone has any announcements or upcoming events to share. I'll go ahead and go first. Commencement is right around the corner, so if we have any graduating seniors on the call here today, just a reminder, the deadline to RSVP for our reception is this coming Monday. So make sure you follow that and RSVP when able. And if anyone else has announcements, feel free to just go ahead and share. Okay, great. Well, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Natalie Cruz to introduce our speaker today. Thank you all so much again for joining.
Thank you so much, Mackenzie. So I'm really happy to welcome Dr. Jamie Shinn, who's in the geography department at West Virginia University. She has a focus on the interactions between kind of humans and the environment and how climate change leads to vulnerability in social and ecological systems, and really working towards a more just and equitable climate future. And so I'm really excited to have her here to talk about some of the work that she's done with flooding and flood recovery in West Virginia. I was really delighted to meet Jamie and to work with her on what's still a pending grant application looking at climate resilience in Appalachia. And so I'm really excited to have her here and to continue to work with her. So thank you so much for being here. And if you'd like to, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Let me just get set up here. Make sure you can all see and hear me. Okay, let me make sure I can see you all. Okay, there we go. Can everyone hear me and see me? Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. It's a really delightful thing to join you from over here in Morgantown, West Virginia, not too far away, and was really glad to get the invitation. So thanks to Mackenzie and Natalie for setting the whole thing up. I am going to give you a kind of overview of the work I've been doing in West Virginia today. So like Natalie said, I'm a human geographer, a human environment geographer, and environmental social scientist. I'm in a department of geology and geography, but very much a geographer. And I had mostly worked before arriving in West Virginia in Southern Africa, in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. And I still have a foot over there, but have slowly been pivoting to work here in Appalachia and specifically in West Virginia because of some flooding events that happened right around the time I moved to begin my position at WVU in 2016. And that's where I kind of really want to focus the talk today. And I'm going to kind of take you on a little journey that centers around this one town. So you can see in this picture, this is the town of Rainelle, West Virginia in Greenbrier County. This is a picture taken by one of my research participants. You'll see it later in the presentation again. But you can see this kind of very quaint hamlet of a town nestled, like so many towns in the region, in a narrow river valley at the base of some steep hillsides. And while the talk centers around Rainelle, I think what I hope to do by the end is show you that the story of Rainelle has broad implications for the region and for the country. But kind of keep this image of this place as we move forward, because we'll see some new images of what it looks like in different contexts as we get going. Sound good? I will try to leave plenty of time at the end for discussion and questions, so I'll try to keep to time here. So as I said, in June of 2016, right at the time that I was moving to West Virginia, the state experienced this massive flood, almost 6 years ago now. On that day, one storm delivered 8 to 10 inches of rain over a 12 to 18 hour period over a large swath of the state. And you'll see a map of that in just a moment. And it was designated as a 1,000-year flood. 23 people lost their lives. It did extensive damage to homes and properties, as you can see there. Of the 55 counties in West Virginia, 12 were designated as federal disaster zones. And that has all sorts of implications for the type of response and recovery efforts that ensued afterward. And that's where I became really interested. What did this response and recovery look like? Before I talk through some of the research that I did in the kind of year after the flood, I just want to show you this drone video. Hopefully you can see that on your screens. This is from June 24th, the day after the flood. This again is Rainelle, so that same town that you saw the picture of on the opening slide. And just try to kind of take in the amount of water that's sitting in this town and what that looked like for people on the ground here. And you'll see this again too. But I just want you to kind of have an image of what that flood meant on those days after the flood. So in May of 2017, along with my colleague, Martina Carretta, who was here at WVU, is now at Lund University in Sweden, we began to do a collaborative project that was semi-structured interviews for the most part down in Rainelle and another town called White Sulphur Springs. And I'll talk about these towns and why we chose both of them in just a moment. Out of that research came 2 articles. Happy to share either of these and links to them. I just want to note them because I am only really going to talk about the first one today, but I just wanted to highlight that the second one exists in case anybody is interested to read it, or I can talk about it during the Q&A. So the second article in Frontiers in Water was this very interesting collaboration, almost experimental paper that Martina and I embarked upon with 2 of our hydrology colleagues here at WVU. And to say this was a labor of love is an understatement. It took several years to write and get this paper out in the world. But what we were trying to do was to merge the hydrosocial framework that's often used by kind of critical social theory human geographers and the social hydro framework that's often used by hydrologists, both of which have the premise of embedding human social systems within the water cycle, but from very different methodological and epistemological standpoints. And we kind of had this multi-year exercise of thinking, what happens if we try to merge these into one holistic framework? And the results are in this paper and kind of continue on in conversation with the group of us about how to move that project forward. So again, I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'm happy to answer questions or to share copies. What I really want to focus on is this other paper, because this paper is really the launch pad for the work that I have ongoing in the region, as I think you'll see. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my my other screen here for notes. So in that paper, what it does is it details findings from semi-structured interviews with residents of these 2 towns, Rainelle and White Sulphur Springs, as well as people who were directly involved in response and recovery efforts in these communities. And hopefully you can see this map on your screens. The blue counties are those 12 counties that were designated as federal disasters. And you can see Greenbrier County is down in the southwestern corner of the state on the border of Virginia. And those 2 red dots are Rainelle and White Sulphur Springs. So Rainelle is kind of on the western edge and White Sulphur is on the eastern edge. So during May through August of 2017, we conducted about 21 interviews with these folks down in Greenbrier County. We selected them through a series of snowball and convenience sampling, women and men ranging in age from 25 to 70. And they were, again, either people directly impacted or people directly involved in response, but often they were both, because almost nobody in these communities came away unscathed, right? And so often we were interviewing people about, recovery efforts, but it became a story about what they lost in their own home or their own family. And so the reason we picked these 2 towns is, 1, because they are both heavily impacted, but 2, because they have slightly different economic situations and socioeconomic histories that we posited would make them differentially vulnerable to the flood and have differential capacities to respond to the floods. And indeed, that's what we found to be true. So you can see from the statistics on the side, neither is a town that is, doing great in terms of economics. Median household incomes are fairly low in terms of national statistics. In Rainelle, 30% of the population is below the poverty line, less than that in White Sulphur Springs, but still a fairly high number. And the histories of these towns are different. So they're both within landscapes that have been tied to extractive industries, but Rainelle specifically has a long history of both timber and coal extraction and has been really hit hard by the decline of those industries in the region. The same story is true for White Sulphur Springs, but White Sulphur has something else that has the Greenbrier Resort, which notably is owned by our coal baron governor, Jim Justice, and is a very high-end resort. If you've heard of it, it might be because it has a world-renowned golf course. It has also a community of second homes owned by very, very wealthy people. And it's also where NFL teams sometimes go for preseason training. So I can tell you stories about eating dinner in a restaurant in White Sulphur Springs, me and the entire Houston Texans team. And so unfortunately, the magnitude of that was lost on me, but my husband was quite excited when I got home and told him the story. And so it's an interesting place, right? But because of the presence of the Greenbrier, there's two things. There's additional economic opportunities for people in White Sulphur Springs that don't exist elsewhere in the county. And there were deep pockets available when a recovery effort was necessary. And so the donations that happened were extensive, including the establishment of an entire NGO called Neighbors Helping Neighbors, which was funded by the Greenbrier Resort community, like the second homeowners, and rebuilt many, many, many homes for people after the flood. So while we saw extensive nonprofit efforts, which I'll talk about, in all of these places, in White Sulphur, they had this extra capacity, right? Extra donations, extra funding. And what that meant is that they recovered more quickly. And I would argue that's both because of their lessened vulnerability before the flood and their capacity to respond after the flood. In Rainelle, it looked different, right? And Rainelle is kind of what I think of as a microcosm of the story that we tell about Appalachia. And I'm not suggesting that story is totally accurate or complete, but it's a story of a place, again, that's lost a lot of jobs due to the extractive industry. It's a place that struggles with a huge amount of addiction, opioid crisis, right? All of the things that we hear about Appalachia all of the time are true in this place, right? And as I'll tell you in a minute, there also lots of other things are true, but this is a place that's been struggling. And as one participant said to us, right, this was really eye-opening for them. How many West Virginians live on the edge with less than no resources, nothing to be able to overcome something like the flood, right? No safety net at all. And while that was true for some people in White Sulphur, it was particularly true for people in Rainelle. But it wasn't all a story of hardship, right, and vulnerability. We also found really important sources of resilience in these communities. And I would say we broke those sources into kind of two categories. The first was just really high levels of social capital. So when we think about social capital in this context, we're thinking about the ability of the community to draw on connections with one another, with relevant organizations to collectively respond to the disaster. And this social capital we found existed really because of a deep sense of community, right? A sense of neighborliness, a sense of place that resulted in things like people mucking out their neighbor's home before they mucked out their own. That resulted in harrowing stories of rescuing elderly folks from attics, right? I mean, the stories people tell, and everyone has a story, are really amazing about what it looked like. I always think of this one story, kind of this very stoic man who I thought really didn't want to talk to me during an interview, started to tell me this story and he started to cry. And this was a common experience to have people become really, really emotional, but also want to tell their story. And he was telling me about mucking out his neighbor who was an elderly woman's home on the 24th or 25th, right after, within the days after the flood. And he's with another group of people doing this, mostly men, and they see a pickup truck slowly coming down the road, right? The roads had just opened up and a truck is coming through and there's a little girl in the back with a sign that says free ice cream. And it turns out she's from a neighboring county. She was desperate to come help. She saw the footage on the news and she asked her mom what they could do. And so he tells the story of all these grown men sitting around licking these half melted ice cream cones crying because they're so moved by this young girl's efforts, right? And I just thought that kind of sums it up for me, right? The kind of story of what it meant to have social capital in this place. But the other thing that people really talk about is the role that the nonprofits played, and particularly these faith-based organizations. And before I was on the ground in Greenbrier County, I had never really fully understood what it meant to have these groups come in. And I never really fully understood the reliance that state and federal governments have on the assumption that these groups will show up. So the Appalachian Service Project, who you'll see a video from in just a moment, the Mennonite Disaster Committee, Samaritan's Purse, all of these faith-based groups that came in and set up shop for years, right? Not just months, but years, in the city halls, and other, like, sharing space with other groups in the community. And what they would do is they would facilitate massive groups of volunteers coming through. So some of you may have participated in like church missions, right? Where you load into a van with your hammers and you head to wherever a place needs you. And so they would get these, they'd be facilitating this onslaught really of volunteers. And in so doing, they rebuilt hundreds of homes for people. And in many cases, people talked about how their home was nicer than it was even before the flood. And it's not just a home, right? But it's furniture and it's appliances. And it was this really complex network of people coming together to figure out need and how to respond to that. And I was really blown away by that. But people also talked about the faith-based groups doing something else. They talked about how people would kind of come in and be like, man, it's really beautiful here, right? And people talk about their eyes reopening to this place that had started to feel like a hard place to be, and kind of seeing it again with renewed eyes, and what that did for their hopes to revitalize this town to be more resilient than it was before the flood. And they talk about that in White Sulphur Springs too, but really, really in Rainelle. And so here are just some quotes, right, from some residents, or from some people we interviewed. And I'll just note that picture while you read the quotes is of a home dedication I was invited to. The Mennonite Disaster Committee had finished this home, had fully refurnished and new appliances, and they were having a dedication, and I was interviewing someone that day, and they invited me to come with them. And it was a really powerful experience. People broke bread together and they prayed together and they gave motivational talks. And even though I was an outsider, I was welcomed into this moment, and it was amazing to see these people kind of how moved they were by what had happened during the flood and then in this recovery effort. And I also noted this home is built at the base of a very steep hillside that to my untrained eyes looked very prone to landslides. And I don't know what is the long-term future for this place, but in that moment, it was very powerful to see. And just a couple more quotes, right? These people coming in from out of state, and they say, look how beautiful it is, right? And you say, oh, it's actually this pretty nice place, right? And this idea that we can't just build off of our history, right? We have to move forward. And I think this has a lot to say about the future of Appalachia. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit, about kind of what we think this means, not just for flood recovery, but for other issues in the region as well. But first, I just want to show you this 2-minute video from the Appalachian Service Project. They were probably the main faith-based group that came, and they made this video that I thought was very powerful. So let me just show you this. Hopefully you can hear it. Coach G was very, very involved in the flood recovery and passed away a couple years ago. Can you hear that?
We estimate that over 90% of the homes in the downtown area, just the couple blocks both ways off the main street of town, 90% of those homes have to be demolished, torn down, and new homes built.
I was devastated. My whole family was. We didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to go.
You see everybody come together to try to help you, it does something to your heart. I mean, it changes you, brother.
We're doing what Christ has called us to do, be servants for those that are not as fortunate as we are.
ASP's work, throughout the summer, throughout the year, across 5 different states, across 30 different counties, is life-changing for so many people.
I've never had nothing like it. I don't know what to say, you know. It makes you want to cry.
This is a blessing. This is my new house. There's no words to describe how I feel.
We do make living conditions better, but I think maybe more important than that, we give people hope.
So I have to say it's really nice when someone makes a video that encapsulates the findings of your paper, because much more interesting to show you that than for me to talk about it. So thanks to ASP for that. So in sum, what we found during this initial phase of work in these communities was this coexistence of vulnerability and resilience, right? This town was not uniquely vulnerable and it wasn't uniquely resilient, but together it was something interesting that we found, right? Both because of social capital, but what happened with the intersection between that social capital, those community connections, and the emergence of the role of the faith-based groups and other nonprofit actors, right? And it provided a disaster response that would not have been possible with state or federal assistance alone. And that to me is noteworthy in thinking about how do we respond to future flooding events? Can we plan better to have these organizations play this role, right? Rather than just like kind of hope the right people show up at the right time and people get the services they need. And there's also all sorts of ways that have come out in the last couple of years about ways in which West Virginia kind of from a federal and state government standpoint, bungled the response, right? So is there a way to kind of improve these really complex disaster responses that we can learn from right now? And I'll talk about how I'm hoping to kind of tackle that in the next project at the very end. But in light of the findings of this paper, I had started to think about a longer term project on long-term flood recovery, right? So how did this hope for revitalization actually play out 3, 4, 5 years after the flood? And it was in the context that I was starting to think about how to do that work when another disaster strikes, COVID-19, right? So of course, like all of you, I wasn't really thinking about my next research project in March of 2019. I was thinking about how to keep my classes running and my family safe and all of the things you all were thinking about too. And also I don't study health, right? So I wasn't thinking, oh, this is an opportunity for research, but I was thinking a lot about people in Rainelle, what was their life like? And I had become quite close to some of my research participants. And so I was thinking about that. And then our Humanities Center here on campus put out a call for research. And I thought, well, actually, this could be a really interesting opportunity to think through vulnerability in the context of another disaster. But I do qualitative work, right? I sit down face to face with people, and that wasn't possible. So it was also an opportunity to really think about exploring a new method, not a new method, but a method that was new to me that I'd been interested in, which is photovoice. And I don't know if you're aware of what photovoice is. I'll give you just a quick rundown. And again, happy to answer questions about this. But photovoice comes out of public health initially, and it's a way in which was designed as a way in which to give marginalized communities a voice at the table in ways that they typically aren't given that voice. And it kind of has 3 main goals, right? To empower people to capture their own knowledge, their own experiences, their own perspectives, to promote dialogue within communities, and then to reach policymakers in somewhat powerful ways beyond the community. And so I'd long been interested in this method, and this seemed like an opportunity to do this. And so through a lot of logistics, which involved me just going to the post office a lot, I was able to get, well, originally the goal was to get 20 cameras into the hands of people down in Rainelle. And their prompt was very broad. Their prompt was to document sources of hope and sources of hardship coming out of the pandemic, not coming out, but living in the pandemic. And that really came out of this idea of resilience and vulnerability coexisting, right? So what did hardship and hope look like in this moment in Rainelle? In the end, 18 people were given cameras, about 9 really dug in. So, some people got the cameras and they were like, I'm actually too busy, or I don't really want to lug around this digital camera. I joke that it looks like it's like 2005 in my lab because there are all these old digital cameras around. But the 9 who were into it were like really, really into it. So they were meant to take pictures for 4 weeks starting in August of 2020. But most of them were like, can I keep the camera? And so like, I want to keep going. So because we had extras, we ended up, me and research assistants who are helping me ended up like having them mail back cameras and mailing them cameras. And again, just like a lot of time at the post office. I joked that I didn't go anywhere in public for like 6 months except the Morgantown post office. And they thought I was crazy. And so the result was about 850 photos, and they're really, really amazing. And through that whole process, we were also doing interviews with folks, checking in about every 2 weeks. What were they capturing? What was their experience? Was anybody yelling at them from taking photos? And they had a clear set of ethics that they were meant to follow, that they signed off on, and this kind of thing. And then finally last June, I was able to go and safely do a focus group with all 9 participants face to face. And it was a really rich kind of half-day experience. And it's Appalachia. So 3 people brought guitars, and it wasn't just a focus group as we think about them. People played music. People had written songs about the pandemic. They'd written songs about the flood. They shared stories. It was amazing. We shared food. And it was such a powerful, it certainly elevated any type of focus group that I've ever run before. And the results were amazing. And so what I'm going to do now is walk you through the preliminary findings. I'm about to send this article out for review. And what you'll see from here are photos and quotes from interviews or focus groups and photos that participants took as part of the project. And I'll just note, so that's the focus group. You can see somebody playing guitar. And then the top photo is just so you can see what the cameras looked like. 2 participants who didn't know one another ran into each other at an event, and they were like, hey, I know that camera. You must be part of the project. And so they took each other's photos, and they've given me permission to share all of this, of course. So the first theme that emerged is this idea of what it looks like to be in a small town during the pandemic. And I think in those early days of COVID, we heard a lot about what it looked like in a place like New York City, but I don't think we heard so much what it looked like in rural America, right? And I thought this quote was really, really powerful. When you know every face in Kroger, right? When somebody in this town dies, you know them, you know their mama, right? It hits us differently, essentially, when everybody knows one another. And I just thought that, I thought that was really powerful. And again, kind of like you see this picture again. So coming back to Rainelle, this was one of the photos somebody took. And when he took this photo, what he said to me in the description is, Rainelle looks a lot nicer from far away. And I thought that was interesting. Lots of other pictures of kind of abandoned buildings and houses, some of which you'll see up close. The other was how pandemic politics played out, right? So we were all part of this. We probably all had conversations with family members and students and university administrators about what we should be doing to respond to the pandemic, but maybe it looked a little different in a very tight-knit community. So the first person to die in the pandemic was actually somebody who had originally enrolled in the project. But when she got her camera, she decided she was too busy, but I had talked to her on the phone a couple of times. She was very lovely. And she worked in City Hall. So she was very public in this small town. And when she died, it hit town really, really hard. And so one of her colleagues from City Hall, who's also a participant on the project, was talking to me about when she died and saying, I saw her in Walmart and she didn't have her mask up. And we joked about it, but she didn't believe in it. She thought it was all politics. And she said on election day, the pandemic stuff would go away. And on election day is when they think she got it. She was on a ventilator for a month. She was in her 70s. This was long before the vaccines, and she died, and that she was irreplaceable. And of course, every life was irreplaceable, but the ways in which it kind of played out in Rainelle, I found to be quite interesting. And so thinking through the politics of rural Appalachia in this moment was part of the story. And of course, the economic hardships, right? But people really tying those economic hardships to these same sources of vulnerability we're thinking about before the flood. And so, there was no economy here before the pandemic, right? Except for extractive resources, the timber and the coal. And once those went away, your only job options were Kroger, McDonald's, Dollar General. And what people said in the focus group was you fell into one of two categories when the pandemic hit. You were already unemployed, or you were an essential worker. You either worked at Kroger or the healthcare center, right? And so you are either vulnerable because you were already under or not employed, or you're now at higher risk and you're worried about bringing your family. And that came up over and over and over again. And so here's a picture of the Rainelle timber yard, which is still active, far, far less so than it used to be. And then of course the ubiquitous train coals pulling through town, or coal trains pulling through town. So that came up quite a bit. But then it started to intersect with the story of the flood. And so everyone has a flood story, right? And so people started to say like in some people were like, the pandemic actually wasn't that big of a deal here because we were already so impacted by the flood. And what they really wanted to talk about was not the pandemic, but their flood story at different points, right? So this idea that like town was devastated and that if there's another one, the only option is to bulldoze into a field, right? And indeed, you see this picture of homes that have been removed after the flood and kind of this intersection that is no more in Rainelle. And people also talk about every time it rains, I get anxious, right? And people talked about, I'm already anxious about floods and now I have to be anxious about the pandemic too, right? And so here's a picture of water pooling up. This is a very common scene in Rainelle. It doesn't take much rain, but now people think, well, that's what it looked like at the start of June 23rd, right? How far is this going to go? So these kind of ongoing anxieties. And then this one research participant in the focus group said, everyone is still devastated about the flood and COVID just planted on top of it. Double whammy. We're intermingling these two catastrophes in our lives and our minds. And that was the moment for me where I was like, oh, that's the story here, right? It's this double whammy of disasters. And people, talk about how we barely survived the flood, businesses, the downtown, and now here comes this other disaster. And what I saw was a real loss of that hope. That I had seen after the flood and the immediate aftermath, that this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for some people. And I don't know what that means for them long term, but there was a real sense of despair more than a sense of hope by the end of by June. It certainly wasn't the end of the pandemic, but at the time that people started to emerge. And these are really interesting images that people took that kind of capture this. So the first, you can see maybe on that house's door, there's an X, and any house with an X on the door means it was searched for survivors of the flood afterward. And then many of these homes were abandoned, where people died, and they were left to sit. And because of a whole host of complex floodplain ordinances and building codes that weren't really implemented in the town, it's been hard to demolish these. And so people talk about this constant eyesore, this constant reminder of what happened on their landscape and what that does on a day-to-day basis. And the other thing they talk about is that they talk about how these abandoned homes have become places where people who are dealing drugs set up shop, and that the addiction crisis has gotten worse in Rainelle in the last few years because of these abandoned properties. So this is a huge issue and something I'm interested in exploring in my next project. The other picture really speaks to the beauty of photovoice, because I got this and I was like, a picture of a sidewalk. I wonder what this is. And then when I interviewed the person about it, he was like, oh yeah, you know what happened is like our sidewalks were already not great. And then they sat underwater for a week and then they were in really bad shape. And we finally got a grant to replace the sidewalks. And we finally got ready to implement the grant. And the pandemic hit and the cost of cement and construction supplies and labor goes up, and we could only afford to finish half the sidewalk in town with the grant. And so for me, the sidewalk picture is this really tangible intersection of the flood and the pandemic coming together. They have, since I've been told, finished the sidewalk, but I haven't been down there to see it. So, but just, an interesting example also of what photovoice can do, right? Maybe that's not a story that would have come out without the photograph. Oh gosh, sorry. Okay, so that's kind of the basic themes that emerged from this project. The next step is we're doing a photo exhibit in Rainelle, I think in May. I'm trying to nail down the date at the library there. We've culled the photos from 850 to 30, chosen with the participants' help and the help of a grad student that's been working with me on the project. And they kind of collectively speak to these themes, and they'll be paired along with quotes. And we'll show that in Rainelle, we'll have everyone who wants to bring their instruments. We'll tell stories, and I hope it will be a real celebration of the project and people's role in it and the town. And so that's for May. And then the photos will be exhibited on campus here at WVU all through next fall. And my key person down in Rainelle is named John Wyatt. He's the only reason I get to do work down there. He's kind of my gatekeeper and key informant and dear friend. And he's a minister and a storyteller and a musician. So he'll come up and he'll kind of talk about the story of the flood and the pandemic from his perspective through music and stories. And so we'll have that event at WVU, and then John will take the photos back with him, and they'll live in the Rainelle Historical Society in perpetuity for them to do as they choose. They're printed now in my lab, and they look great. And then they'll be online. So I hope you'll all get to look at them online when we get them up and running. And so that's kind of where the project has come to at this point. But what I want to do briefly is just scale out for a second and tell you that I don't think this is the story of Rainelle, right? I think this is a story of something much deeper in both our region in Appalachia, but also within a nation that's struggling with how to respond and prepare for a future of flooding. And there have been a series of articles in NPR and the New York Times and other outlets in the last year that have really spoken to this. In particular, the screenshot is from a New York Times article by the reporter Chris Flavelle, who's doing amazing work and amazing reporting on this. And you may have heard of this guy, Joe Manchin. You're welcome. But it's been really interesting to see the role of West Virginia in this national discourse around climate policy and all of the other things right now. And if you think you're frustrated, talk to us over here in West Virginia. But it's been really interesting to see ways in which the state is all of a sudden like in this national dialogue. And I'm happy to send links to any of these articles. But I really wanted to hone in on this article from NPR, which actually went to Rainelle and actually said, hey, Rainelle is the bellwether for this country. And I was like, couldn't believe my eyes, right? Here's this little town that I've been spending all this time in, and now it's part of this national NPR story. And what NPR did in this article is they drew from new data from the First Street Foundation, the flood factor data. If you haven't played with it, it's really, really accessible. It's a great teaching tool to engage students and things like this. In conversations about flooding, you can search your own home address or your own, your own school or whatever you want to do. But it is much more fine-grained than the FEMA floodplain data that we have, which we know is fairly out of date. And it also takes into account climate modeling. And you'll notice in that map of where people are at risk for flood damage, a very, very dark spot over our region of the country. And people were really surprised by this. It was the most calls I've ever gotten from the media saying like, what is happening? Like, we expected coastal Louisiana, we expected Florida, but what's going on in Appalachia? And I think we could talk about lots of things, topography, extractive histories, and everything else. But I think it finally kind of elevated for people that this is also an Appalachian problem when we're thinking about flood vulnerability. And it says as much, right? In the article, it talks about concentrated on the coasts and in Appalachia, but it also says poor people are the most vulnerable, right? And now we can break down the term poor, and we can think about all the ways in which it's more nuanced than that. But I kind of was like, oh my gosh, I'm not screaming into the void anymore. Like, people are talking about this, right? That like there are these issues of vulnerability that have nothing to do with climate that are making people vulnerable to climate. And so I was really heartened to see that. And then it says, right, towns like Rainelle are a bellwether for the future, right? And they're talking here specifically about flood insurance. And I can talk about what we found around flood insurance. I'll just say quickly that FEMA redrew the floodplain in 2012 for this part of the state and actually gave people the option to drop their flood insurance, which of course they did because it's very expensive. And many of those homes were flooded in 2016 and made them have a harder time accessing FEMA money and insurance money. And so lots to say about flood insurance here, but this is what the article is really calling out. And they interview this minister in Rainelle, and right, he talks about people didn't have the insurance and what that did to people and this sense of hopelessness, right? So again, really echoing some of the findings from this paper. So I think this is a national conversation, right? And I think Rainelle has a lot to tell us is the takeaway. So what's next? I'll just wrap up with this. I have a proposal in development with a bunch of civic partners down in Greenbrier. What they're telling me is that systematically since the 2016 flood, nobody has sat down to document the lessons learned, right? So kind of lots of people have lots of pieces of knowledge about what went right and what went wrong, but nobody's documented it or formalized that into a plan, right? And so our proposal is to do just that from the perspective of both the communities and flood response people, so state, federal, whatever, but really getting into communities and saying what worked and what didn't work. Let's document that. And then what do we need to do based on that to prepare? In tandem with that, we're proposing some updated floodplain maps, flood risk maps done with climate models taken into account by colleagues here at WVU who are GIS experts. And then if that works, if the proposal is funded and we can kind of develop this more coordinated response effort, then our hope is to scale that up to high-risk communities across West Virginia. So my hope is that I get to come back and tell you about that project someday, but that's where we're at right now. So let me stop there, and I'd be delighted to hear any questions or thoughts that you have.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Really appreciate the presentation. Typically, these are always very interesting and informative, but this one was extremely touching too. So thank you so much for sharing your research and stories on Rainville. At this point in time, folks, if you have questions, feel free to turn your cameras on, unmute yourselves. You can use the raise your hand feature or drop questions in the chat for us to address.
Jamie, that was just fantastic. Oh, sorry, Natalie, did I just jump over?
You go.
Okay, that was just fantastic. I've taken a whole page of notes. Everything you said is just crystallized so many questions. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, that I don't work a lot in disaster recovery myself, but I work along the edges. And you mentioned, that having the faith-based organizations in that video, I mean, that seemed to really make a difference and really connect with folks. And you said, how do we make that intentional? But at the same time, I know I'm not quite sure the word I'm looking for. There's historically like a lot of rightful hesitancy in some areas for bringing in faith-based organizations. And because some are more reliable or more effective than others. And so do you have any ideas of what the process would be for, I don't want to sound blasphemous or evil, but the right faith-based organizations?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. And it brings up all sorts of things for me, just as a person. Like, people talked about really like conservative groups coming in, and then you have to make sure that LGBTQ community members are not on their team. And I can't say that that's how I think disaster recovery should go, right? There's like real ethics involved. And so I do not have the answer. I do know that some were highly organized, had a huge capacity, and were extremely open. So notably the Appalachian Service Project, I just found them to be amazing. And the Mennonites, I had no idea that the Mennonites had such a huge disaster arm, but they do. And they were similarly just kind of like really engaged in the community. And I didn't see any of those issues, at least in my time, or hear any issues of those groups. But the other thing people talked about in like the localized emergency response offices was like, I don't know how to deal with outsiders. Like, I know how to deal with West Virginians, but like somebody comes in from New York City, they don't know what to do in right now, right? And that's a thing. And so, but is the Red Cross better at that? Or the National Guard? I mean, the stories about what the National Guard did are also like, so is there a way that we like set up pre-disaster protocols for some of this? Maybe that would help.
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks, Leanne. That's a really great question, and something I hadn't thought about either, about how to prepare to communicate with these folks and work with them. Diversity, of people. I see we have Maria with her hand raised. If you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then Natalie. Sorry, I skipped you, Natalie.
Yes, thank you so much. That was a very good presentation. I really enjoyed and learned a lot from it. I am a student at Ohio University. I'm pursuing my master's in geography, and my area of interest are kind of lies in line with what you are really doing. And my thesis, I'm exploring from gender perspective how floods have affected people, and my focus is in Kenya, informal settlements.
Great.
I'm currently planning to do my to go and collect data in Kenya, but I really wanted to hear from you, how did you manage the emotional distress that comes with when you are trying to having conversation or getting focus group discussion? Are there any possibility of emotional distress that comes in when these people are trying to talk about the floods that affected them? And how did you manage that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. It's such a good question. And I'll just say, if you want to talk another time, most of my research before this project was in Botswana around funding, including gender dynamics within flood response and recovery. And so there might be some interesting points of connection with your work in Kenya. And so happy to talk through that. So I guess I'll say two things. One is just methodologically, I often think about the dynamics of who is in a focus group. And so in the work I've done in Botswana, I've been really careful to have people kind of assign themselves to focus groups along gender lines because of power dynamics within households. So trying to leave space for women to be able to collectively speak in ways that they might not if male household heads are present. And so that's something I have thought about from a broad perspective in previous work. In this case, we only had these 9 people. And so I just did the one focus group, but it was something I considered. And I tried to there's always the loud person in the focus group, right? And you're always trying to draw out the person who's less comfortable speaking. Often that's a gender-based thing, or you could break it down along gendered lines, but I just did the best I could in that moment with those 9 people. It generally went pretty well for that one. But the thing about the trauma is really important. And so I was really, really hesitant to keep going with interviews when I started working down there in 2017, because of the amount of emotion it brought up for people. So I was constantly saying, if you don't want to tell me this story, you don't need to tell this story. If this is fine, obviously people always have the option to opt out, but I had to really remind people to a person. People were like, oh no, I want to talk about it, right? And a lot of people talked about it being the first time they ever really fully told their story. And these were harrowing stories, like houses getting ripped off foundations and running into a bridge and blowing up because the propane tank blows up, right? People saw traumatic things and they lost traumatic things and they lost people. But I found that people wanted to talk about it. Now, I will hypothesize that part of the problem here is that there was 0 mental health services in those communities. And I think in terms of long-term flood or disaster recovery, we need to think about what that means. And we need to increase mental health capacity in general, but also particularly around post-disaster trauma. But I just tried to be really sensitive and really careful and continuously remind people they didn't have to tell me their story. And people were very generous and did. But you could argue that that wasn't the right thing and that I should have stopped altogether. So, but I'm happy to talk more about that with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jimmy. Natalie, I'll kick it over to you.
I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about the flood insurance nuances in Rainelle. I think it's, I know it's kind of it feels bureaucratic, but it's such an important part of a lot of these rural communities.
Yeah. I'm just kind of digging into some of this because I've realized it's flood insurance seems boring, but it's actually so important, and we need to think about access here. And so a couple of things have come up. What I mentioned about FEMA redrawing the floodplain maps and people dropping their insurance, huge issue. We need better floodplain mapping. We need to better account for who is deemed at risk, right? And who live and account better for climate models. So one thing we're trying to do in this new project is do that work. My colleagues here, the GIS folks, are actually making these amazing 3D models of floodplains and looking at which buildings are at risk. And we're hoping that will help people make the decision whether or not they need flood insurance, but then it's access to insurance, right? And so it's all well and fine to say we should make flood insurance more accessible for homeowners, but what about people who don't own homes, right? So I talked to a few people in both of these towns who are in rent-to-own situations, but they didn't yet own, but they were close and they lost everything. And that made them completely ineligible for FEMA homeowner recovery stuff, right? So they were on the path to homeownership, and that was all lost. right? Or I had talked to two guys who lived in the trailer park in White Sulphur Springs, and it just wasn't viewed the same, right? When they got to the FEMA money and what their property was worth. Both of those people ended up in a newly built home on higher up on land that was rebuilt by this group from the Greenbrier Resort, right? But they talk about how they grew up on that piece of land where their homes were. And while they were very thankful for their new homes, they still had to like say goodbye to this riverfront property. And then there's all sorts of stuff around floodplain ordinances and who should be able to build where. And that brings in like all sorts of ethical questions. And in a place like West Virginia, there's not a lot of high land to build on, right? It's just not an option. So the answer to your question is that I have no idea, but it's this massive thing we need to tackle. And I do think like the fact that NPR article came out, it's been in a couple of other major articles I've seen. There seems to be a national awakening to the idea that flood insurance is really important. And I'm super curious if I can get this new project off the ground, how much flood insurance comes up. I think it's going to be a lot.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's just this huge unexplored or underexplored area that, you know, we know that the most vulnerable people, the people who are living right by these flashy streams, are ones who don't have it and who don't have any resources. So I'm excited you're following up.
Thanks, Natalie. That's a great question. I will go on any others. We have a couple more minutes, probably time for maybe one or two more questions.
Hi, I had a question. First of all, I really loved your talk. That was really cool. And it was really interesting to see like how strongly the community responded, and other communities, so many organizations to help Rainelle. That's really awesome. I was wondering, was there any kind of organized response to help with mental health and addiction problems afterwards? No.
So addiction separately, but just the like flood mental health, no, I have not heard of any, and I have explored this question because I'm really interested in it. I've not heard of any single mental health service that arrived in the community. I could have missed something. But interestingly, one of the folks who was involved in the photovoice project is a retired psychologist. So he has lots to say about this. And he's done some digging around because there is like a rural kind of traveling health service clinic called like Seneca Services or something in West Virginia, but he can't find any evidence that they were there after the flood, and there's certainly not been anything long-term. Whether or not people would even seek it out, right? There's all these stigmas around mental health services, but it needs to be made available for people. And so no, I didn't see any of that in the responses from, either the nonprofit responses or the federal and state responses. So as far as I can tell, no. In terms of the addiction stuff, there's lots of stuff happening. And I just got off a call yesterday with John Wyatt, the minister, folk singer, key informant of mine, and he's put together a group of clergy people who are working on addiction issues in Greenbrier and surrounding counties. And they had their first meeting, and he said 150 people showed up, most of them in the clergy, he said. So there's like this massive, he was like, it was the most positive thing that's happened in Greenbrier County in so long. And so I think there's massive momentum around how to figure out this issue. And if you're following the news, right, West Virginia is like suing Big Pharma right now around some of this. And you all are, no stranger to the issue. I know it's just as big of an issue there as it is here. But I do think there's some really interesting organization around it. And I'm super interested in thinking through kind of what are the intersections here of increasing resilience and decreasing vulnerability through addressing the opioid epidemic.
Awesome, thank you. Also, are there any organizations that you know of that do it in general after disaster events or deal with mental health?
No, but it's something I've been meaning to look into. Like, are people showing up after Hurricane Maria or Hurricane Katrina, right? I don't know. There's so much more work coming out around those disasters since they're longer ago. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'd love to hear it if you know.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I have a question in the chat if you have time for one more. Jay asking, is there anything about the geography or climate of Rainelle and the surrounding region that made it vulnerable to this massive flood?
Yes, absolutely. So narrow river valley, steep hillsides all around it. 3 small creeks feed into one major creek through town, extremely flashy. And so kind of all the creeks filled, and there was a confluence of these 3 creeks coming together, and just a massive rising of water really, really quickly. I mean, people talk about like just kind of how fast it happened, and similar dynamics in White Sulphur Springs as well. But then, you know, what's the role of decades of the timber industry? Some of my participants would say, like, I was on the phone in an interview with one of my participants, and she kind of started to bring this up. And I was like, well, how prevalent do you think this is? And she was like, well, I don't know, but I can see them clear cutting my neighbor's hillside as we speak. Right. And so what is the role of long-term extraction of timber? And then there is some documented evidence down in like the southern coal fields where there's been more mountaintop removal of ways in which that's fed into sedimentation of streams and runoff and that kind of thing. So there are these natural factors, but I think there are probably also other factors at play. And I don't have a concrete answer for what plays what role. Lee, were you going to say something about the mental health services? Did you have insight? Oh, I thought you were.
No, I was just going to ask if there was a vaccine hesitancy, but that's a whole nother thing that I'll just send you an email about because we're at the end.
Super. And yeah, Natalie, you're right. The infrastructure is this huge issue. So lack of regular dredging, lack of infrastructure is an issue everywhere in the region, but particularly in Rainelle. And there have been some efforts to do more dredging in recent years, but dredging alone is not going to be the answer here. And so there are a lot of questions about what infrastructural changes need to happen.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. We are at time. Really appreciate you taking the time to give this amazing presentation today. I know there were many takeaways, and just want to express our gratitude to you for taking the time to speak to us, and hope to bring you back and hear more in the future on your research, what happens in the future in Rainelle. Folks, I appreciate you tuning in throughout the entire semester. This is our last one of the spring semester. So best wishes to you all finishing out spring semester. Hope you all have a great weekend, a great summer break, and hope to see you back for the Public Service Perspective series in the fall. Hopefully we can start, moving back to in-person too. So thank you again, Jamie, and thanks everyone.
I'm really grateful for your time and the invitation, and I'll look forward to continuing this conversation with some of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie.
Thanks,
Thanks,
folks.
appreciate it.
Have a great afternoon.